while pharaohs strutted through gold-drenched palaces under the blazing desert sun, hundreds of miles away, deep within the earth, thousands of souls were slowly dying in eternal darkness. Not mythology, not legend. This is the true story of ancient Egypt's gold miners. People history deliberately forgot. You've seen them in movies. Glittering treasures unearthed from tombs, golden death masks gleaming under museum lights. But trust me, acquiring all that precious metal was nothing like those romanticized archaeological montages where handsome explorers brush away sand to reveal treasures. It was dirty, brutal, soul-crushing work. And in almost every case, it literally sucked the life from your body. Gold wasn't just decoration in ancient Egypt. It was divinity solidified. The flesh of the gods, they called it. A substance so pure and eternal, it could bridge mortal pharaohs to immortal deities. But while priests chanted and nobles adorned themselves, someone had to extract this godly material. Therefore, entire populations were condemned to the darkness below. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us for tonight's educational content. Gold mining was so horrific in ancient Egypt that archaeologists examining miner remains sometimes mistake them for torture victims. Their skeletons tell stories, no hieroglyphics recorded, spines warped from crawling through tunnels barely wider than their shoulders, lungs filled with quartz dust that essentially turned to glass inside them. And let's not forget mercury poisoning from the extraction process, because nothing says professional development like your teeth falling out while your brain slowly liquefies. The ancient Egyptians had a name for these mines, the place of punishment. But this wasn't just punishment for criminals or prisoners of war. Therefore, entire families lived this nightmare for generations, born into a legacy of darkness from which there was no escape. Imagine your career counselor suggesting slow death underground as your best employment option. At least modern job interviews don't typically end with being chained to other applicants. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids reaching toward the sun. The irony is that the civilization obsessed with light and rebirth built its splendor on the backs of those who never saw daylight. The miners who extracted Egypt's wealth lived in a different universe than the one glorified in hieroglyphics. Their universe was pitch black, suffocatingly hot, and incredibly loud, like being stuck in the world's worst nightclub, except instead of overpriced drinks, you get collapsing tunnels. Deep within the eastern desert and Nubian mountains, Egypt's gold mines were engineered marvels of human suffering. Some tunnels extended thousands of feet into solid rock, all carved by hand and bone. No power tools, no hydraulic drills, no ergonomic desk chairs with lumbar support. Just stone hammers, copper chisels, and the occasional wooden wedge if you were feeling particularly innovative that century. But gold doesn't just sit in convenient nuggets waiting to be plucked like desert fruit. Therefore, extracting it required crushing ore, washing it, and then heating it with mercury, a process that killed miners as efficiently as it purified gold. If the collapsing tunnels didn't get you, the toxic fumes eventually would. Ancient Egyptian career longevity was measured in months, not years. Their version of retirement planning was figuring out which family member would drag your body out when you inevitably collapsed. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. While Egypt's religion promised glorious afterlife to those who could afford proper burial rituals, miners were often interred in mass graves, anonymous in death as they were in life. No golden funerary masks for them, despite spending their brief existence extracting the very material that might have granted them eternity. Tonight, we're going to descend together into this forgotten world, not as tourists gawking at exotic suffering, but as witnesses to lives' history erased. Because the true foundation of ancient Egypt wasn't limestone blocks or papyrus scrolls. It was human bodies broken in darkness so that others might shine in light. The most terrifying aspect of ancient Egyptian gold mining isn't the physical torment, though that was horrific enough. It's the deliberate erasure. The fact that we know more about royal cats than we do about thousands of miners whose labor built an empire. Gold outlasted them all, glittering through millennia, while their names vanished like smoke in those suffocating tunnels. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones found not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where history forgot to look. And the darkest tunnels often reveal the most about what we value and who we're willing to sacrifice for it. So who were these forgotten souls who disappeared into Egypt's golden mountains? Let's start at the beginning. Your story doesn't begin with glory or celebration. It begins with dust. You were born into the noble, soot-covered lineage of ancient Egyptian gold miners. No crowns, no fancy titles, just the family pick, ore-shaped calluses, and the scent of earth and fear baked into your baby blanket. Your birth wasn't celebrated with feasts or ceremonies, just quiet resignation from parents who knew exactly what life had in store for you. Your earliest memories aren't of sunlight or open skies. They're of flickering oil lamps, the musty smell of underground passages, and your father's silhouette, shoulders permanently hunched from decades of stooping. While other Egyptian children played along the Nile, learning to swim or catching fish, you were learning how to breathe efficiently in spaces where oxygen came at a premium. A survival skill they definitely didn't teach in those fancy scribe schools in Memphis. From the moment you could walk without stumbling into a mine shaft, you were expected to help. By age 4, you're officially your father's assistant, which is a polite Egyptian way of saying unpaid child laborer with zero rights and permanent rock dust embedded in your skin. Your toys? Bits of discarded ore. Your playground? The mine entrance where at least a whisper of fresh air might occasionally reach your lungs. But children weren't just convenient labor for ancient Egyptian mining operations. Therefore, mine owners specifically sought families rather than individual workers. Children had smaller bodies, could squeeze into narrower tunnels, and hadn't yet developed those pesky adult concerns about personal safety and mortality. The perfect mining resource, renewable, replaceable, and remarkably compliant when threatened with starvation. Your father doesn't speak much. Years of dust have made his voice sound like stone grinding against stone. He teaches you everything through gestures, grunts, and the occasional slap when you handle tools incorrectly. Not because he's cruel, though the darkness has certainly hardened him, but because a mistake underground isn't just inconvenient. It's potentially fatal for everyone. While noble children in the capital memorized hieroglyphics and religious texts, your education was considerably more practical. How to test for unstable rock, how to measure oxygen by how your lamp flame behaves, how to navigate pitch-black tunnels by memory and touch alone, how to ignore hunger, thirst, and the overwhelming urge to see the sky. Your graduation ceremony. The first time you were sent into a tunnel too narrow for adults, armed with nothing but a small chisel and your own racing heartbeat. Fun childhood games in the mines included Don't Wake the Scorpions, Guess How Much Longer Until Tunnel Collapse, and everyone's favorite, Pretend You Can Still Feel Your Fingers After 12 hours of chiseling. The prize for winning was simple. You got to wake up and play again tomorrow, assuming you woke up at all. But the child mortality rate in ancient Egyptian mines wasn't just high. Therefore, it was so expected that mothers often wouldn't name their children until they survived to age 7 or 8. Why bother getting attached to someone who would likely be crushed, suffocated, or poisoned before reaching puberty? It was a practical approach to parenting in an environment where sentimentality was an unaffordable luxury, like proper tools or adequate food rations. By the time ordinary Egyptian children were learning a trade or preparing for marriage, you already had the body of an old person. Your growth stunted from malnutrition and lack of sunlight. Your lungs compromised from years of dust inhalation. Your joints swollen and painful. Your skin pale where it wasn't stained permanently black from ore. You'd seen other children disappear, some into tunnel collapses, others into the silent grip of mining diseases with no names but familiar symptoms. You learned not to ask where they went. Questions invited unwelcome attention. You never learned to read or write. The only symbols that mattered to you were the ones etched into tunnel walls, marking dangerous passages or promising veins. Instead of studying animal-headed gods, you prayed to the darkness itself, not asking for salvation, just for one more day without catastrophe. Religion for miners wasn't about the glorious afterlife promised in elaborate tombs. It was about surviving this life hour by excruciating hour. The cruelest part wasn't the physical suffering, though that was substantial. It was knowing that somewhere above you, people walked freely under the sun, eating fresh food, drinking clean water, and sleeping without the weight of a mountain threatening to collapse on their chests. Occasionally you'd see the mine owners or royal inspectors, their clean clothes and well-fed bodies as alien to you as the hieroglyphic texts they carried. They never looked directly at child miners, perhaps because acknowledging your humanity would make their comfortable lives more difficult. Your childhood wasn't just stolen, it was sacrificed, burned as offering on the altar of Egyptian wealth and religious obsession with gold. While pharaohs commissioned elaborate death preparations, you and your fellow child miners were already practicing for death, working in what was essentially a tomb, one that didn't even offer the dignity of remembrance. Most children born to mining families never reached adulthood, and those who did were so damaged they could barely function outside the mines. But the few who survived long enough to have children of their own, therefore perpetuated the cycle, creating new generations condemned to the same darkness. Not from cruelty or indifference, but from a terrible pragmatism. Better to teach your child to survive in hell than to dream of a heaven they'll never reach. The only education that mattered was learning to suppress hope. Dreams of escape or a different life were more dangerous than cave-ins. They bred resentment, anger, risky behavior. Successful mining children, the ones who made it past age 10, developed a peculiar mindset. Not quite resignation, not quite acceptance, more like a detachment from the very concept of alternatives. The mine wasn't just where you worked. It was the entire universe. Everything else was just stories told by people who would never understand your reality. There were no childhood rites of passage, no celebrations of growth or learning. Your milestones were grimmer. First blood drawn from handling ore, first tunnel navigated alone, first time watching another child die. Each experience layering over your humanity like sediment, gradually turning you to stone from the inside out. By your 10th birthday, not that anyone kept track or celebrated, you already had the 1,000-yard stare of a battle-hardened soldier. Your hands were cross-hatched with scars. Your back permanently bent. Your voice rarely used except for necessary communication. Other mining children recognized you as one of them, not by your appearance, but by your silence. The particular quiet of someone who has accepted their place in the world's foundations, invisible but essential. You weren't born to carve your name into history like pharaohs and nobles. You were born to carve the earth itself, to hollow out mountains in search of gold that would never benefit you or anyone you loved. Your birth wasn't the beginning of a life's journey. It was merely the first step into a darkness that would define, consume, and eventually claim you. Another nameless sacrifice to Egypt's golden gods. This is your life now. Welcome to the family business. Hope you like dust, darkness, and the particular kind of childhood where you're already halfway to your grave before you've lost your first tooth. But what exactly was this hellish workplace that consumed generations of forgotten Egyptians? What kind of environment could break children before they became adults? Let's descend together into the dark heart of ancient Egypt's most terrible secret. If ancient Egyptian tombs were engineered for the comfortable eternity of the dead, their gold mines were designed for the torturous mortality of the living. Imagine crawling into a hole barely wider than your shoulders, where the air itself seems to have weight, and the darkness is so absolute it becomes a physical presence pressing against your eyeballs. Welcome to your workplace. No orientation session, no safety briefing, just you versus geological time. The gold mines of ancient Egypt weren't just holes in the ground. They were elaborate labyrinths of human suffering. Architectural marvels of exploitation carved into mountains and deserts across Egypt's eastern regions and Nubia. Some stretched miles into solid bedrock, tunneling deeper than any modern tourist is allowed to venture into a pyramid. At least pyramids had the courtesy of being designed with human movement in mind. Mine tunnels were designed with only one consideration: following the gold veins, human anatomy be damned. But the Egyptians didn't discover gold by accident. Therefore, they developed sophisticated prospecting techniques, identifying promising locations by the presence of certain white quartz formations that often contained gold. Ancient geologists could read landscapes with remarkable accuracy, which is impressive until you realize their scientific curiosity was directly proportional to how many lives they were willing to sacrifice in pursuit of shiny metal. If they'd put that same innovative energy into plumbing or air conditioning, history might have taken a different turn. The primary mining regions included the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, and Nubia, modern Sudan. Some of the most productive and deadliest were clustered around Wadi Hammamat and Wadi al-Aki. These weren't convenient locations with pleasant Mediterranean breezes. They were among the most inhospitable environments on Earth, where daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees on the surface. Underground it got worse, much worse. Entering an ancient Egyptian mine felt like descending into a nightmare designed by committee. The main shaft typically plunged at a steep angle, requiring miners to essentially rock climb in reverse, in the dark, while carrying tools. Hope you didn't skip leg day at the ancient Egyptian gym, which wasn't a thing, but neither was workplace safety, adequate ventilation, or the concept of reasonable working hours. But these weren't just simple holes dug into hillsides. Therefore, the Egyptians engineered surprisingly complex mining operations with main shafts, secondary tunnels, air shafts, and working chambers. For people who lacked power tools, explosives, or basic human decency toward their workforce, they were remarkably effective engineers. They could calculate precise angles for tunnels that would intersect perfectly hundreds of feet underground. Impressive when you consider most modern people can't successfully estimate how much leftover pasta to store after dinner. The layout of a typical mine resembled a nightmarish ant colony. Main shafts descended at approximately 40-degree angles, often extending 300 to 400 feet into the earth. From these, narrower horizontal tunnels branched out, following gold veins through the rock. The tunnels shrank as they extended, sometimes becoming so tight that only children could access the furthest reaches, which was precisely the point. Nothing maximizes efficiency like exploiting the smallest members of your workforce. Lighting came from simple oil lamps, small clay dishes filled with animal fat, and a twisted reed wick. These provided about as much illumination as a birthday candle in a cathedral, casting just enough light to make the shadows more terrifying. They also consumed precious oxygen while releasing smoke in an already suffocating environment. It was like working inside a chimney, except chimneys at least have the decency to open at the top. The mines had their own microclimate of misery. As you descended, temperature increased roughly 1 degree for every 60 feet. In deeper sections, temperatures could reach 130 degrees Celsius, with humidity approaching 100%. Imagine working in a sauna while wearing nothing but a loincloth, breathing air that's mostly dust, and hammering at solid rock for 12-hour shifts. Modern luxury spas charge good money for heat treatments, but they typically don't include the risk of being crushed to death. Ventilation was the perpetual challenge. Early mines relied on natural air circulation, which is a polite way of saying, hope enough oxygen drifts down so everyone doesn't suffocate. Later, operations incorporated rudimentary air shafts, narrow vertical tunnels connecting different levels to create minimal airflow. When these failed, which was often, workers would simply wave cloth or palm fronds to circulate air manually, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of an office fan, except your performance review was measured in whether your colleagues were still conscious. But oxygen wasn't just a comfort issue. Therefore, low oxygen environments created additional dangers beyond the obvious risk of suffocation. Oil lamps would flicker and die, leaving miners in perfect darkness. Judgment became impaired, increasing accident risks, and prolonged exposure to oxygen-poor environments caused long-term brain damage, though perhaps that was a mercy, dulling the awareness of one's horrific circumstances. The sound inside a mine was its own special torment. The constant tap-tap-tap of stone hammers against rock, amplified by tunnel acoustics. The creaking of support beams under strain. The labored breathing of fellow miners. The occasional shout when a new vein was discovered, or more frequently, when someone was injured. All of these sounds combined into a terrible symphony that played continuously, day and night, in the background of your existence. Water was both essential and deadly in the mines. Essential because miners needed to drink more than the average Egyptian due to extreme heat and exertion. Deadly because many mines hit underground water tables, causing sudden flooding. Sophisticated drainage systems were developed, channels carved into tunnel floors leading to collection points where water could be manually removed using leather buckets. Picture a deadly water park where the slides go nowhere and the lifeguards are actually there to make sure you don't escape. The rock itself wasn't just an obstacle, it was an active enemy. Quartz, which often contained gold, is one of the hardest natural substances. Miners attacked it with stone hammers, bronze chisels, and wooden wedges. The resulting dust contained microscopic quartz particles that, when inhaled, sliced into lung tissue like thousands of tiny knives. Modern medicine calls this silicosis. Ancient Egyptians called it the breath that steals life, poetic for something that was essentially death by 1,000 microscopic cuts. Support structures in the mines were minimal at best. Wooden beams braced tunnel ceilings and walls at critical junctions, but most passages remained dangerously unprotected. Rockfalls were so common that miners developed a sixth sense for impending collapse, detecting subtle changes in sound, air pressure, or the behavior of insects and rodents that shared their underground world. When your emergency alert system consists of "the rats are running away," you know your workplace safety program needs serious reconsideration. The gold veins themselves were often disappointingly thin, sometimes just a few millimeters wide, threading through the quartz like delicate golden spiderwebs. Miners would follow these threads through solid rock, removing tons of worthless stone to extract ounces of precious metal. The ratio of effort to reward was astronomical. But from the perspective of mine owners and pharaohs, therefore, the math worked perfectly. Human lives were cheap, gold was valuable, and the supply of desperate laborers seemed infinite. Ancient mines weren't just physical spaces. They were psychological environments engineered, deliberately or not, to break human spirits as effectively as they broke human bodies. The constant darkness disoriented your sense of time. The endless tunnels confused your sense of direction. The inescapable danger eroded your sense of security. The knowledge that the mountain could reclaim you at any moment destroyed your sense of future. After enough time underground, miners often reported feeling that the mine itself was alive, watching, listening, waiting to consume them. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the underworld is described as a place of trials, darkness, and judgment. For gold miners, that afterlife began while they were still breathing. The mine wasn't just where you worked. It was a living tomb where you rehearsed your death daily, carving your own sarcophagus with each swing of your hammer, one tunnel at a time. And yet, this nightmare wasn't something you experienced once and went home. It was your every waking moment, from dawn to dusk, day after excruciating day. Let's walk through what a typical day looked like for those condemned to Egypt's golden hell. Your day in the mines begins before the sun remembers it has a job to do. While the pharaoh sleeps beneath golden canopies and priests still dream of heavenly conversations, you're already awake, your body responding to an internal alarm clock calibrated by fear. There's no 5 more minutes when you're part of Egypt's underground workforce. Punctuality isn't motivated by pride or discipline. It's driven by the simple understanding that latecomers might receive a beating, reduced rations, or worse. The mining settlements weren't exactly featured in ancient Egyptian Homes and Gardens magazine. You live in crude stone huts clustered near mine entrances, windowless, doorless structures barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Your bed is a thin reed mat on bare earth. Your belongings fit in a small cloth bundle. Your most valuable possession, perhaps the small stone amulet passed down from a grandparent who somehow survived the mines, or maybe just the sharpened piece of copper that serves as your personal chisel. Breakfast isn't so much a meal as a brief negotiation with starvation. A handful of dried dates, maybe some coarse bread, and a sip of water that tastes like liquid geology. Meal planning in mining communities followed a simple philosophy: provide just enough calories to keep workers alive, but not enough to fuel resistance or escape attempts. The ancient Egyptian version of portion control, except instead of maintaining a beach body, you're maintaining just enough strength to swing a hammer for 12 hours. But mining wasn't just physically demanding. Therefore, supervisors developed efficient systems to extract maximum labor from their human resources. However, these systems weren't designed with worker well-being in mind. Thus, the daily routine was precisely calculated to balance between working miners to death immediately, inefficient, and allowing them enough recovery to provide years of service, optimal return on investment. You don't walk to the mines, you shuffle, part of a human chain linked by exhaustion and shared misery. Guards with wooden staves enforce the procession's pace. They rarely need to use them. Everyone knows the routine. Everyone understands the consequences of disruption. The morning air might be the coolest you'll feel all day, but you barely notice it. Therefore, your mind is already retreating to that dissociative state that makes survival possible, the psychological equivalent of drawing the blinds during a storm. At the mine entrance, you're divided into teams with specific assignments. Some will extend tunnels, others will extract identified ore, still others will transport material to the surface. The youngest children are sent deepest, their small bodies navigating tunnels where adults couldn't fit. It's like a terrible corporate organizational chart where career advancement is measured in proximity to daylight and the entry-level positions have the highest mortality rates. Tools are distributed: stone hammers, copper chisels, reed baskets for ore. Nothing has improved in centuries. While Egyptian artisans were crafting intricate golden artifacts of breathtaking sophistication, mining technology remained deliberately primitive. Innovation was reserved for people who mattered. For miners, technological advancement meant occasionally getting a new piece of cloth to wrap around your hammer handle when the old one disintegrated from blood and sweat. Descending into the mine is like voluntarily entering your own burial chamber, except there's no mummification, no canopic jars, no elaborate funeral rituals, just darkness swallowing you whole. The temperature rises with each step downward. Sounds change, becoming both muffled and amplified in the strange acoustics of underground tunnels. You can hear other miners breathing, stone striking stone, the occasional shout or cry echoing from unseen passages. Your assigned section might be hundreds of feet below the surface. The journey there is a gauntlet of physical challenges: narrow passages where you crawl on hands and knees, near vertical descents where you cling to crude handholds carved into rock, chambers so low you work in a permanent crouch. Workplace ergonomics consisted of adapting your body to the mine, never the other way around. If chiropractors had existed in ancient Egypt, they'd have either made a fortune or died from despair at the unfixable damage. The actual work makes modern manual labor look like a spa retreat. Veins of gold-bearing quartz were attacked with stone hammers, pounding for hours to create cracks. Copper chisels and wooden wedges were inserted to split the rock. Progress was measured in inches per day. A successful shift might yield enough gold-flecked quartz to fill a few baskets, representing countless hammer swings, torn muscles, and irreversible joint damage. But gold-bearing quartz wasn't just hard to extract. Therefore, miners developed a grim expertise in reading stone, identifying promising veins by subtle color variations or crystalline patterns. This knowledge wasn't written down in fancy papyrus scrolls or taught in schools. It was passed through generations by workers who could barely see what they were showing their apprentices, passed through touch and sound rather than sight, a tactile inheritance of suffering. Time underground loses all meaning. There's no sun to track, no hourglasses or water clocks. You measure the day in pain increments, when your shoulders begin to burn, when your knees start to bleed through your loincloth, when the thirst becomes so intense, your hallucinations include imaginary waterfalls. The only certainty is that it will continue until your supervisors decide you've met your quota or until you collapse. Water breaks were brief and strictly controlled. A single clay vessel might be passed among dozens of workers, each allowed a carefully measured sip. Some supervisors added salt to the water, not enough to make it undrinkable, just enough to increase thirst and prevent miners from feeling satisfied. It was ancient Egypt's version of a productivity hack, though modern management consultants would probably avoid putting deliberate dehydration in their PowerPoint presentations. Heat was your constant companion, a malevolent presence that seemed to have physical weight. In deeper tunnels, temperatures regularly exceeded 130 degrees, with humidity approaching 100%. Your body tried to cool itself through sweating, but in such conditions, sweat doesn't evaporate. It just creates a film of moisture that collects rock dust, forming a grimy second skin. Miners often worked naked, or wearing only the smallest loincloth, yet still emerged from shifts looking like they'd been submerged in a slurry of mud and blood. Accidents weren't the exception. They were a statistical certainty. Tunnel collapses, falling rocks, tool injuries, falls. If you were lucky, death came quickly. If not, you might lie trapped under rock for hours while work continued around you. Resources weren't wasted on elaborate rescue operations. The cold calculation was simple. Is it faster to save the trapped miner or to dig a new tunnel around them? Mining supervisors were history's first efficiency experts, treating human life as just another resource to be optimized. At day's end, if you survived, you emerged into blinding sunlight with eyes that had adapted to darkness. The transition was painful, disorienting. You shuffled back to the settlement, carrying nothing but fatigue, and perhaps a few new injuries to add to your collection. Evening meals were marginally better than breakfast. Some boiled grains, occasionally dried fish, maybe even vegetables during good seasons, just enough to ensure you could do it all again tomorrow. Sleep came quickly, but brought little rest. Dreams were haunted by the sounds of the mine, the feeling of walls closing in, the terror of collapse. Many miners developed a distinctive sleep pattern, short, shallow cycles interrupted by moments of panicked wakefulness. Their bodies never fully relaxed, remaining perpetually ready for danger. Medical papyri make no mention of treating mining-related trauma or stress. Like the miners themselves, their suffering existed outside the boundaries of what Egyptian society considered worthy of documentation. Some nights, you might hear singing from the older miners, low rhythmic chants that sound more like mourning than celebration. These weren't songs of resistance or hope. They were sonic anchors, reminders that human voices could still exist in a world designed to crush humanity. The lyrics were simple, repetitive, focused on endurance rather than escape. No one sang about freedom. No one dared. This wasn't just your day. It was every day, an endless cycle of extraction, of gold from stone, of life from bodies, of time from existence. You didn't live to work. You worked to postpone dying, caught in a brutal equation where your suffering was the necessary variable that kept Egypt's divine economy functioning. Your day wasn't just hard labor. It was a ritual sacrifice performed with your body as both priest and offering. But the true horror of mining life wasn't just what happened to you each day. It was what happened to you over time, as the constant assault of the mines systematically dismantled your body piece by piece. Your body wasn't designed for mining. It was crafted for sunlight, for movement across open spaces, for reaching upward, not for being crushed into geological crevices day after day. But after years in the mines, your anatomy becomes a map of systematic destruction, each part transformed by suffering into something barely recognizable as human. The physical degradation begins so gradually you hardly notice, until one day you realize you've become a walking archaeological exhibit of occupational damage. The ancient Egyptians, who documented everything from cat behavior to beer recipes, left virtually no medical records about mining injuries. But this silence wasn't due to ignorance about miners' suffering. Therefore, it reflected a deliberate decision to ignore an inconvenient truth at the foundation of their golden civilization. However, archaeological evidence speaks volumes where historical texts fall silent. Thus, the skeletal remains of miners tell stories of biblical-level suffering through bone deformities, stress fractures, and premature arthritis. Let's start at the top and work our way down through this catalogue of corporeal catastrophe. Your skull, that supposedly solid protection for your most vital organ, develops distinctive wear patterns at the crown and forehead. Why? Because when tunnel ceilings are only 3 feet high, your head becomes a third limb, sometimes used to brace against the rock while you work. It's the ancient Egyptian version of a hard hat, except instead of protective equipment, it's just your actual skull doing its best impression of construction gear. Your teeth fare no better. The combination of stone dust in everything you eat, grinding your molars from stress, and using your mouth as a third hand to hold tools when both arms are occupied creates a distinctive dental disaster. Most miners lost teeth by their 20s, not from poor hygiene, but from treating their mouths like tool belts. Archaeologists can identify miner remains from dental wear patterns alone, the ultimate ancient Egyptian career identifier, though not one you'd want on your hieroglyphic resume. Next, your spine, perhaps the most dramatically transformed part of your anatomy. The human vertebral column evolved for upright walking, but mining required contorting into positions that would make modern yoga instructors file for workers' compensation. Therefore, miners' spines developed characteristic deformities: forward curvature from constant stooping, lateral twisting from hammering at awkward angles, and compression fractures from carrying heavy loads through low tunnels. By age 30, if you somehow lived that long, your silhouette would be permanently hunched, your height reduced by inches, your movement accompanied by the constant symphony of popping vertebrae. The shoulders and arms of miners tell their own horror story. Repeated hammering motions created asymmetrical musculature. One arm typically developed to twice the size of the other. Shoulder joints showed signs of repetitive stress injuries, including tears in the rotator cuff and ossification of tendons. Some skeletal remains reveal shoulders that were dislocated so frequently that the socket actually deformed to accommodate the chronic instability, a grim anatomical adaptation that allowed for greater range of motion at the cost of constant pain. Your body wasn't just damaged, it was redesigning itself around the damage. Hands and wrists suffered perhaps the most visible transformations. Constant gripping of tools created characteristic calluses so thick they appeared almost like natural gloves. Bones in the palm frequently showed stress fractures that healed improperly, creating a distinctive gnarled appearance. Fingertips were often worn to the point that fingerprints disappeared entirely, rubbed away by constant contact with abrasive stone. The ancient Egyptians never developed fingerprinting for identification, which is fortunate for miners who wouldn't have had any left to record. Your knees and ankles endured their own special torment. Crawling through narrow tunnels on surfaces literally designed by nature to be abrasive wore away cartilage, leaving bone grinding directly against bone. Skeletal remains show distinctive wear patterns on kneecaps and ankle joints, unlike those seen in any other profession. Modern orthopedic surgeons would look at miners' knee x-rays and immediately recommend total joint replacement, possibly followed by a strong letter to the Pharaoh's Occupational Safety Administration, which, unfortunately for you, wouldn't be established for another few thousand years. The respiratory system's destruction was perhaps the most insidious because it happened largely unseen. With each breath, you inhaled microscopic particles of quartz dust that embedded in your lung tissue. These particles were essentially tiny shards of glass that sliced into delicate pulmonary structures with every expansion and contraction of your chest. The resulting condition, silicosis, caused progressive scarring that reduced lung capacity and eventually led to respiratory failure. Miners developed a distinctive cough so recognizable that Egyptian texts occasionally reference the quarryman's bark, perhaps the world's first documented occupational disease, though certainly not one that inspired medical research. But the damage wasn't just structural. Therefore, the cumulative effect of these injuries created systemic problems throughout the body. Chronic pain led to elevated stress hormones, disrupting sleep, digestion, and cognitive function. Poor nutrition, combined with intense physical demands, resulted in compromised immune systems, making miners susceptible to infections that might be trivial to others. The body, desperately trying to repair itself, diverted resources from non-essential functions like reproduction. Many male miners experienced reduced fertility, creating yet another way the mines claimed future generations. The sensory organs didn't escape unscathed. Eyes adapted to perpetual darkness developed heightened sensitivity but reduced acuity. Many older miners could detect the slightest movement or light change, but struggled to focus on details in normal daylight. Hearing became paradoxically both damaged and enhanced. The constant percussion of hammers on stone caused tinnitus and partial deafness. Yet many miners developed an almost supernatural ability to detect subtle acoustic changes that might signal impending tunnel collapse. It was like having the world's worst superpower, Collapse Man, able to predict disaster but unable to escape it. Sleep, that essential human reset button, was permanently broken for most miners. Pain prevented deep sleep, while the psychological trauma of daily near-death experiences triggered nightmares and hypervigilance. Many developed a distinctive half-awake state where they could rest while maintaining partial awareness of their surroundings, a survival adaptation that unfortunately meant they never experienced truly restorative sleep. Some mummified remains show evidence of miners who died with their muscles still tensed, as if their bodies had forgotten how to fully relax even in death. The skin, your body's first defense against the world, became a living record of mining life. Beyond the layers of embedded dust that gave miners their distinctive grey pallor, their skin told stories through scars, thousands of them, from minor nicks to substantial gouges where flesh was torn away by sharp stone edges. Areas that contacted rock surfaces regularly, knees, elbows, shoulders, developed patches of skin so thick and calloused they resembled hide more than human tissue. These adaptations provided some protection, but at the cost of normal sensation. Many older miners lost the ability to feel gentle touch, experiencing the world only through pressure and pain. Perhaps most disturbing was how mining changed the very way you moved. Miners developed distinctive gaits and postures that identified them immediately. The stooped shoulders, the shuffling walk, the way they turned their entire body instead of just their neck due to spinal fusion. Even when briefly above ground, miners navigated the world as if still surrounded by stone walls, keeping their elbows close, ducking slightly when passing through doorways even when unnecessary, maintaining the physical adaptations that kept them alive underground. Their bodies remained in the mine even when they weren't. What's remarkable isn't just the extent of physical destruction, but how completely it was normalized. There were no disability accommodations, no modified duties for injured workers, no concept that this level of bodily sacrifice might be unreasonable. The broken body was the expected body. The unbroken miner simply hadn't been working long enough. Your body wasn't just a tool used to extract gold. It was itself a resource being extracted until nothing usable remained. Each shift in the mine converted bone, muscle, and breath into gold for someone else's crown, someone else's eternity. You weren't just breaking rock. You were being broken, systematically, deliberately, and completely, one heartbeat at a time, until the person who entered the mine existed only as a memory inside the bent and wheezing figure that emerged. But physical breakdown was only the beginning. While your body was being crushed from the outside, something far more insidious was attacking you from within. A silent killer that would ultimately prove more devastating than any collapsing tunnel. If the physical destruction of your body wasn't enough, there was something far more insidious waiting in the shadows of the mine, silent, invisible, and absolutely lethal. The ancient Egyptians didn't just ask miners to extract gold from stone. They asked them to embrace poison as a daily companion. Mercury, the shimmering liquid metal that enabled ancient Egypt's gold processing, was slowly turning miners into trembling, confused shadows of their former selves, long before they understood what was happening to them. The deadly relationship between gold and mercury began innocently enough. Ancient Egyptian goldsmiths discovered that mercury had a remarkable property. It bound with gold, but not with other materials. What looked like magical attraction to the precious metal was actually chemistry at work. But this seemingly magical process came with a terrible price. Therefore, miners were exposed to mercury at every stage of refinement. However, neither they nor their overseers understood the gradual poisoning taking place in their bodies. Thus, what appeared to be a brilliant innovation in metallurgy became one of history's deadliest occupational hazards. The extraction process was deceptively simple. Crushed gold ore was mixed with liquid mercury, which bound to the gold particles, separating them from worthless rock. The resulting mercury-gold amalgam was then heated, vaporizing the mercury and leaving relatively pure gold behind. It was elegant, efficient, and absolutely devastating to human health. The ancient Egyptians had essentially invented a perfect delivery system for mercury poisoning, one that affected miners through skin absorption, inhalation, and even ingestion when they ate with contaminated hands. You wouldn't notice the effects immediately. That was part of mercury's treachery. Unlike a collapsed tunnel or broken bone, mercury poisoning was patient. It accumulated in your system day by day, month by month, building up in your tissues like a slow-motion assassination. The initial symptoms could easily be mistaken for the normal exhaustion of mining life: headaches, fatigue, muscle weakness. Nothing that would raise alarms in a workforce already expected to suffer. By the time the distinctive symptoms appeared, the damage was irreversible. It was like having a subscription to terminal illness monthly, where each issue arrived in your body without warning. The mouth and teeth were often the first visible casualties. Miners exposed to mercury developed distinctive gum problems, bleeding, receding tissue, and teeth that loosened and fell out for seemingly no reason. The Egyptians, who developed sophisticated dentistry for the upper classes, apparently never connected these symptoms to mercury exposure. They likely viewed it as just another occupational hazard, like calluses or broken bones. Modern dentists would recognize mercury poisoning immediately, but ancient Egyptian dental plans apparently didn't cover occupational toxicology consultations. Next came the tremors, perhaps the most recognizable hallmark of mercury poisoning. They began subtly, often in the hands, a slight shakiness when reaching for tools or food. But these tremors weren't just inconvenient. Therefore, they progressed until miners couldn't hold tools steady or feed themselves without spilling. Some archaeological evidence suggests that older miners were given different tasks not out of mercy, but because their tremors had rendered them useless for precision work. Job reassignment in the ancient world. When your nervous system becomes too damaged for your primary task, you get the equally terrible backup position. The psychological effects were perhaps the most disturbing. Mercury is a neurotoxin that progressively damages the brain, causing dramatic personality changes, emotional instability, and cognitive decline. Miners in the later stages of poisoning experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and explosive anger, alternating with periods of depression. Some ancient Egyptian texts make references to mine madness, or workers who became touched by evil spirits. Almost certainly descriptions of severe mercury poisoning. Imagine experiencing what amounts to chemically induced mental illness, while simultaneously being expected to perform dangerous physical labor in near darkness. It's like having your worst anxiety dream come true, except you never wake up. Memory loss was particularly cruel in a culture that emphasized remembrance and afterlife preparation. Miners with advanced mercury poisoning often couldn't recall their own names or recognize family members. Some would forget basic skills they'd performed for decades. There are fragmentary accounts of miners who had to be guided back to their sleeping quarters because they could no longer remember where they lived. In a civilization obsessed with preserving identity after death through elaborate tombs and funerary texts, these miners were experiencing a form of identity death while still breathing. Sleep disturbances added another layer of torture. Mercury poisoning disrupts normal sleep patterns, causing insomnia alternating with periods of excessive sleepiness. Miners might go days barely sleeping, then suddenly collapse into unconsciousness at dangerous moments. Some described vivid, terrifying nightmares, so realistic they couldn't distinguish them from waking life. Sleep, the one brief escape from mining existence, became yet another landscape of suffering. It was like paying for a vacation package to somewhere worse than your workplace, which takes real commitment to awfulness. The digestive system didn't escape Mercury's effects. Chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and loss of appetite led to extreme weight loss and malnutrition, compounding the physical weakness caused by neurological damage. Some miners developed a distinctive metallic taste in their mouth that made eating difficult. Others experienced nausea so severe they couldn't keep food down. In a workforce already provided with minimal sustenance, these symptoms accelerated the physical decline that Mercury initiated. The ancient Egyptian diet plan: work harder while eating less because your own body is sabotaging your ability to process nutrients. Definitely not recommended by modern nutritionists. Perhaps most devastating were the reproductive effects. Mercury readily crosses the placental barrier, causing severe birth defects and miscarriages in pregnant women. Men experienced reduced fertility and sexual dysfunction. Mining families had higher rates of infant mortality and children born with developmental issues. While the Egyptians couldn't have understood the mechanisms at work, they would have observed the patterns. Yet another way, mining didn't just claim individual lives, but generations. The pharaoh's obsession with dynastic succession and genetic purity apparently didn't extend to concern about the fertility and reproductive health of those extracting their precious metals. But what makes Mercury uniquely horrifying isn't just its effects. Therefore, it's how it changes the victim's perception of their own decline. Mercury poisoning damages the very brain that might recognize something is wrong, creating a tragic situation where the person becomes incapable of understanding their own deterioration. Ancient Egyptian medical texts make no mention of treatments for mercury poisoning, suggesting that its victims were simply allowed to deteriorate until they died or became too disabled to work, at which point they were discarded like any other broken tool. The cruelest irony: after all this suffering, the final gold products were considered pure, divine, and health-giving. Pharaohs wore gold because it represented immortality, using it in their elaborate tombs to ensure eternal life. Gold extracted through a process that caused miners to die slowly, painfully, and confused was transformed into symbols of everlasting life and health for the elite. If there's a more perfect metaphor for the exploitation at the heart of ancient civilizations, it would be hard to find. Archaeological evidence tells this story through the remains of mining communities. Hair and bone samples from miner burials show mercury levels dozens of times higher than those of contemporary Egyptians from other professions. Some remains reveal such high concentrations that modern archaeologists must use protective equipment when handling them, protection the miners themselves never had. These silent witnesses speak across millennia, their poisoned bones testifying to suffering that historical records largely ignore. What makes this ancient tragedy relevant today is how little has changed. Modern gold mining in developing countries still uses mercury in many of the same ways, causing similar patterns of poisoning and neurological damage. The faces and languages have changed, but the essential relationship remains the same: disposable workers absorbing poison so that others might wear beauty. The ancient Egyptians didn't invent toxic exploitation, they just perfected it with divine justification. You didn't just die in the mines, you dissolved. Your body, your mind, your identity gradually broken down and washed away while you were still breathing. Death by mercury wasn't just the end of life. It was the slow, confusing erasure of self long before the heart stopped beating. Your poisoned body became the alchemical vessel where gold's purity was purchased with your disintegration. A transformation no Egyptian god bothered to witness or honor. But who exactly filled the ranks of these living dead? Where did ancient Egypt find an endless supply of bodies willing to enter this toxic nightmare? The answer reveals perhaps the darkest aspect of this ancient civilization's golden obsession. Not everyone in ancient Egypt had the misfortune of being born into a mining family. Some had to earn their place in this underground hell through other accomplishments, like being captured in battle, committing crimes, or simply being in the wrong ethnic group when a pharaoh needed more bodies to throw into the darkness. The Human Resources Department of ancient Egyptian mining didn't just rely on generational workers. It actively recruited from society's most vulnerable and powerless populations. Egypt's gold mines weren't operated on voluntary labor or competitive wages. They ran on desperation, punishment, and the systematic exploitation of those with no alternatives. But the Egyptians didn't view this as cruel. Therefore, they saw it as perfectly aligned with Ma'at, their concept of cosmic order and justice. However, this convenient philosophy effectively sanctified brutal labor exploitation. Thus, the mines became Egypt's most terrible prison, one where the sentence was always the same: work until you die, whether that took days or years. Prisoners of war constituted a significant portion of the mining workforce, particularly during Egypt's expansionist periods. Military campaigns against Nubia, Libya, and various Levantine kingdoms produced thousands of captives who were marched across deserts in chains before being delivered to mining regions. These weren't professional soldiers, but often farmers, craftsmen, and even scholars, people with no mining experience suddenly thrust into the most dangerous labor in the ancient world. Imagine being a weaver or a scribe one day, and the next finding yourself hundreds of feet underground with a stone hammer in your hand, and a guard threatening to withhold water if you don't meet your quota. Ancient Egyptian career transitions didn't come with orientation sessions or transferable skills workshops. The Nubians suffered particularly harsh treatment in the mines. Coming from lands rich in gold, they were often assumed to have special knowledge about gold extraction. This assumption rarely matched reality, but it didn't stop overseers from setting higher expectations for Nubian workers. The tragic irony: many were forced to mine the same gold that had been taken from their homelands for generations, processing metal that might have been discovered by their ancestors. It was colonialism in its most direct form, extracting both resources and lives from conquered territories. Talk about adding insult to injury. It's like being forced to cook a meal from ingredients stolen from your own kitchen, except the meal is deadly and the kitchen is on fire. Criminals represented another significant population in the mines, but Egyptian justice wasn't concerned with rehabilitation. Therefore, serious offenses were often punished with a life sentence to the mines. The definition of serious offense could be remarkably flexible. Theft, tax evasion, insulting a noble, or even failing to participate in religious ceremonies could all result in mining condemnation. Ancient Egyptian judges didn't bother with nuanced sentencing guidelines. Their justice system basically had three settings: fine, beating, or send them to the mines. The mines were essentially their version of a maximum security prison, except without the modern amenities like walls, roofs, or the theoretical possibility of release. Political prisoners formed a smaller but notable group. Those who challenged pharaonic authority or religious orthodoxy might find themselves disappeared into the mines, their names erased from records as thoroughly as their bodies were erased by labor. Some evidence suggests that entire families could be condemned together for the crimes of a single member, a particularly effective way to eliminate political opposition across generations. The ancient Egyptians understood that killing dissidents creates martyrs, but working them to death in distant mines creates only silence. It was cancel culture taken to its most extreme and literal form. Religious offenders faced similar fates. In a society where religion and state were inseparably intertwined, challenging religious dogma was equivalent to treason. Heretics, cult followers, or those who damaged religious property could all find themselves on the one-way journey to the mining regions. The irony, of course, is that they were then forced to extract the very material considered sacred to the gods they had allegedly offended. Imagine being sentenced to hard labor for not believing in divine power, then being forced to mine the physical embodiment of that power until it killed you. The ancient Egyptians really understood poetic punishment, even if poetry was the last thing on the minds of those suffering through it. Debt slaves represented a particularly tragic category. In periods of famine or economic hardship, Egyptians might sell themselves or family members into servitude to cover debts or simply to survive. While some debt slaves worked in domestic settings or agriculture, the most desperate often ended up in the mines. Unlike criminals or prisoners of war, these were citizens who had fallen through the cracks of Egyptian society. Their labor literally converted into gold that would never alleviate the poverty that condemned them in the first place. It was the ancient world's most predatory lending practice, with interest rates calculated in lifeblood rather than currency. Children within these condemned populations suffered especially cruel fates. Small bodies were valuable in narrow tunnels, leading to the deliberate separation of children from parents to work in different sections of the mines. Some evidence suggests that children as young as 4 were put to work carrying water or sorting ore before graduating to more dangerous tasks as they grew. These weren't the children of mining families who at least had parents to teach them survival techniques. They were isolated, terrified youngsters thrown into lethal conditions with minimal instruction. Think of it as the world's worst boarding school, where the graduation ceremony involved either death or becoming so physically broken you could only perform surface-level tasks. The demographics of punishment changed with Egypt's political fortunes. During the Old Kingdom, most miners were Egyptian criminals and debt slaves. The Middle Kingdom saw an increase in Nubian and Libyan prisoners as Egypt expanded southward. By the New Kingdom, the mining workforce had become remarkably international. Hittites, Sea Peoples, and captives from as far away as Mesopotamia could be found, breaking rocks alongside Egyptian convicts. The mines were essentially a catastrophic melting pot where diverse cultures united in their shared misery. It was multiculturalism at its darkest, literally and figuratively. But despite these diverse origins, mining populations were remarkably homogenized by their experience. Therefore, distinctions of nationality, religion, or former status quickly became meaningless. Former nobles worked alongside former slaves, united by their new identity. Expendable resources. The mines were perhaps the ancient world's great equalizer. They reduced everyone to the same brutalized state, regardless of previous station. Social mobility in ancient Egypt usually meant climbing upward, but the mines represented a rare opportunity for downward mobility, where everyone eventually reached the same bottom. A cruel social hierarchy did exist within this underworld. Newly arrived prisoners typically received the most dangerous assignments, the deepest tunnels, the least stable sections, the tasks with highest mortality rates. Those who survived long enough might eventually be assigned slightly less lethal duties, not out of mercy, but because they'd developed skills valuable enough to warrant preservation. It was less a promotion than a slight postponement of the inevitable. Employee retention in the mining industry was based entirely on how long they could keep you alive enough to remain productive. The psychological impact of this punishment system was deliberately devastating. Miners weren't just deprived of freedom, they were systematically stripped of identity. Names were replaced with numeric designations. Distinctive clothing or cultural markers were removed. Religious practices were forbidden unless they aligned with Egyptian orthodoxy. Communications with the outside world were severed. Even when death finally came, it was anonymous. Bodies disposed of in mass graves without funeral rites or markers. The Egyptians, who believed proper burial was essential for afterlife, effectively condemned miners to a double death, once in life and once in eternity. Perhaps most psychologically crushing was the knowledge that their suffering directly contributed to the wealth and spiritual power of the very system that condemned them. Each ounce of gold they extracted strengthened the pharaoh's connection to the gods, funded the military that had captured them, or adorned the temples of deities who had apparently sanctioned their torment. Modern prison labor at least pretends to have a rehabilitative component. Ancient Egyptian mining was exploitation distilled to its purest form, without even the thin veneer of redemption. Foreign prisoners in particular faced an additional layer of alienation. Removed from homelands, separated from families, surrounded by unfamiliar language and customs, they experienced a cultural death parallel to their physical deterioration. Some evidence suggests these prisoners developed syncretic religious practices, blending their native beliefs with Egyptian concepts in desperate attempts to make sense of their fate. Prayers were offered to composite deities, asking not for freedom, but simply for quicker death or numbing of pain. When your theology evolves to include praying for a faster death, you know your employee satisfaction surveys would return some pretty grim results. Whether born to the mines or condemned to them, whether Egyptian or foreign, criminal or debtor, adult or child, the result was ultimately the same. The mines devoured all distinctions along with all hope. Human beings entered and were systematically unmade, not just worked to death but processed through a system designed to extract everything: labor, health, identity, humanity, and finally, life itself. You weren't serving a sentence in the mines. You had become the sentence. A human sacrifice offered daily on the altar of Egyptian prosperity, one swing of the hammer at a time. Yet somehow, even in this manufactured hell, the human spirit found ways to endure. The most remarkable aspect of the mining horror wasn't just what was done to people, but how those people adapted to survive the unsurvivable. How do you survive the unsurvivable? Faced with crushing physical conditions, toxic exposure, and a system designed to extract your life along with the gold, miners developed psychological adaptations so extreme they might seem alien to our modern minds. Their mental survival strategies weren't just coping mechanisms. They were radical alterations of consciousness that allowed human beings to endure conditions specifically engineered to destroy them. The first and most fundamental adaptation was psychological detachment, a profound disconnection from one's own body and circumstances. But this wasn't simple dissociation. Therefore, it was a deliberate, cultivated state that miners taught each other. However, achieving this state required sacrificing parts of normal human consciousness. Thus, miners existed in a liminal mental space, physically present but psychologically elsewhere, conscious enough to work but detached enough to endure unendurable pain. Experienced miners could identify newcomers instantly by their reactions to suffering. Fresh arrivals screamed when injured, wept from exhaustion, or raged against their circumstances. Veterans watched with hollow eyes, knowing these emotional responses wasted precious energy and attracted unwanted attention from overseers. The emotional learning curve in the mines was brutally steep. Adapt or die. It was natural selection applied to psychology, where the most successful mental mutation was the ability to feel less. Darwin would have had a field day studying the psychological evolution happening in these underground torture chambers, though he probably would have needed therapy afterward. Time perception became dramatically altered in long-term miners. With no access to sunlight and workdays structured around quotas rather than hours, miners developed what some ancient texts describe as stone time, a strange perceptual state where the present moment expanded to fill all awareness, while past and future receded to irrelevance. They didn't count days or measure weeks. They existed in an eternal now, punctuated only by cycles of work and brief rest. It was mindfulness meditation's evil twin, present moment awareness, not for enlightenment, but for enduring endless suffering. Modern wellness retreats charge thousands for consciousness-altering experiences, but they typically feature more organic smoothies and fewer collapsing tunnels. Memory itself underwent strategic reorganization. Many miners described intentionally forgetting their previous lives, Not because they couldn't remember, but because remembrance was too painful. Others maintained elaborate memory palaces, mental spaces where they could retreat during the worst physical torment. Some focused on tiny details: the particular pattern of rock veins, the rhythm of hammer strikes, the subtle changes in tunnel acoustics, developing heightened sensory awareness that simultaneously anchored them to reality and provided escape from it. Their brains basically created internal Netflix accounts with very limited programming options, playing the same few pleasant memories on repeat while the body suffered through the latest episode of Today in Torture, Underground Edition. Pain response underwent perhaps the most dramatic adaptation. Miners didn't just develop higher pain thresholds, they reconstructed their entire relationship with physical suffering. Minor injuries, cuts, bruises, burns, stopped registering as noteworthy events. Major injuries were processed with eerie detachment. Some miners described pain not as a sensation happening to them, but as something they observed happening near them, as if their nervous system had been rewired to report suffering as distant information rather than immediate experience. It wasn't that they felt no pain, it was that they developed the ability to experience pain without being psychologically destroyed by it. Think of it as the world's worst superpower, not immunity to pain, but the ability to coexist with it as a roommate rather than an invader. Sleep patterns adapted to maximize survival rather than rest. Miners developed the ability to fall asleep almost instantly when opportunity arose, even in uncomfortable positions or amid loud surroundings. But this sleep wasn't normal. Therefore, it typically occurred in short bursts rather than consolidated periods. Many developed the ability to maintain partial environmental awareness while sleeping, instantly waking at signs of danger. It was the ancient Egyptian version of power napping, except instead of boosting productivity for your startup, you were trying not to die before your next shift. Perhaps most remarkable was the development of micro-communities within this hell. Despite every pressure to turn against each other, miners formed tight-knit support networks based on mutual protection. These weren't friendships in any conventional sense. They were survival alliances, where members watched for falling rocks, shared water, and sometimes carried injured companions rather than leaving them to die. In archaeological remains of mining settlements, researchers have found evidence of shared living spaces where miners apparently slept in tight groups, likely for warmth and protection. Ancient Egyptian team-building exercises were less about trust falls and more about, "I'll pull you out if the tunnel collapses on you, if you'll share your water ration when mine runs out." Language itself transformed in the mines. Workers developed specialized vocabularies with terms for different rock formations, danger signs, and tool techniques. In multinational mining populations, hybrid languages emerged, simplified communication systems that borrowed from Egyptian, Nubian, Libyan, and other tongues. These mining pidgins were functional rather than expressive, focused on survival information rather than emotional connection. Some evidence suggests miners also developed coded communication, ways of conveying messages that overseers couldn't understand, small linguistic rebellions in a world where open resistance meant death. It was the ancient world's version of creating workplace slang, except instead of complaining about your boss's annoying habits, you were trying to warn others about imminent deadly collapse without getting beaten for speaking out of turn. Humor, surprisingly, played a crucial role in psychological survival. But mining humor wasn't about joy. Therefore, it was darker than the tunnels themselves, gallows humor taken to extremes. Miners joked about death, suffering, and the absurdity of their existence. These weren't jokes meant to provoke laughter, but to acknowledge shared reality and release tension. Archaeological evidence includes carved figures and graffiti, suggesting miners maintained this grim humor even in their limited free time. One partially preserved inscription roughly translates to, "Best view in Egypt, complete darkness." Comedy in the mines wasn't about being funny, it was about refusing to let horror have the final word. Spiritual adaptation took perhaps the strangest forms. Many miners abandoned traditional Egyptian religious practices, which must have seemed cruelly ironic given that they were extracting materials for temples they'd never visit to honor gods who'd apparently abandoned them. Instead, evidence suggests the development of underground spirituality, syncretic beliefs that combined elements of various traditions with mine-specific rituals. Some miners made offerings at tunnel entrances or carved protective symbols into tools. Others developed fatalistic philosophies that helped them accept their circumstances. These weren't organized religions, but psychological survival mechanisms dressed in spiritual clothing. Frameworks that made the unbearable slightly more bearable. It was like creating your own religion where the primary commandment was, "Thou shalt not completely lose thy mind, despite having every reason to do so." The most profound psychological adaptation was the reconstruction of identity itself. To survive the mines, many described needing to become someone else, not metaphorically, but literally, creating a new self that could endure what their original personality couldn't. This wasn't role-playing, but fundamental identity alteration. Some took new names. Others developed distinct mining personas separate from their true selves. In the most extreme cases, miners spoke of their previous identities in third person, as if that person had died and been replaced by the mine-hardened self now inhabiting their body. It was dissociative identity disorder as survival strategy, multiple selves, not as pathology, but as adaptation. What's most remarkable about these psychological changes is that they weren't random. They were taught, shared, and refined across generations. Veteran miners inducted newcomers into these mental techniques, passing along not just practical knowledge, but psychological survival strategies. Evidence suggests designated teachers sometimes existed in mining communities, individuals who had survived long enough to accumulate both practical and psychological expertise. These weren't formal positions, but emerged organically from the desperate need to preserve and transmit survival knowledge. The tragedy is that these extraordinary psychological adaptations, while enabling survival, exacted devastating costs. Miners who managed to leave the mines, a rare occurrence, often found themselves unable to reintegrate into normal society. The very adaptations that kept them alive underground made normal human connection nearly impossible above ground. Their altered consciousness, essential in the mines, became a barrier separating them permanently from ordinary human experience. They had survived, but at the cost of the very humanity they had been trying to preserve. In the darkest places on Earth, human consciousness proved both remarkably fragile and astonishingly adaptable. The mind, when faced with unendurable reality, didn't simply break, it transformed, creating new ways of being that defied normal psychological categories. These weren't just coping mechanisms, they were evolutionary leaps forced by extreme pressure, new forms of human consciousness born in humanity's most inhumane creation. For every 1,000 miners breaking their bodies in darkness, there were dozens of men whose job was ensuring that suffering continued without interruption. The overseers and guards of Egyptian gold mines weren't just administrators. They were the human machinery that transformed royal decrees into broken bodies, the living instruments that converted pharaonic ambition into daily terror. Their faces were the only representation of authority most miners would ever see, their voices the only law that mattered in the underground world. These weren't simply cruel men who happened to find suitable employment. The Egyptian mining system specifically selected and trained individuals capable of enforcing brutality as routine policy. But being an effective overseer wasn't just about physical intimidation. Therefore, the most successful mining administrators combined tactical violence with psychological manipulation. However, maintaining control over thousands of desperate people required systematic methods beyond random cruelty. Thus, the Egyptians developed sophisticated control systems that used minimal resources to maintain maximum oppression. The hierarchy was precisely calibrated. At the top sat the mine administrator, typically a mid-level noble, with connections to the royal treasury or priesthood. He rarely entered the mines themselves, instead occupying the sole comfortable dwelling in the settlement, often with imported luxuries that served as obscene contrasts to the surrounding squalor. Below him were section chiefs responsible for different operational areas: extraction, processing, security, and logistics. These men lived in modest but separate quarters and enjoyed privileges like better food and occasional visits from family. It was the ancient Egyptian version of middle management, complete with performance metrics and quarterly reviews, except their KPIs measured human suffering rather than sales targets, and failing to meet quotas could mean joining the miners they supervised. The true enforcers of daily discipline were the line overseers, men who spent their days in the tunnels monitoring work, setting quotas, and administering punishment. Many were former soldiers chosen for physical strength and comfort with violence. Others were former miners who had survived long enough and demonstrated sufficient loyalty to be elevated from the ranks, the mining equivalent of Stockholm Syndrome promotions. These men occupied a psychological borderland, not quite administrators, not quite miners, distrusted by both groups, yet essential to the operation. They lived in constant fear of being demoted back to mining status if productivity in their section declined, creating a desperate incentive to drive workers beyond reasonable limits. Physical security was maintained by guards, typically the lowest-ranking members of the Egyptian military or local conscripts. They were stationed at mine entrances, along transport routes, and throughout the settlement. Their primary purpose wasn't preventing escape. The surrounding desert did that effectively, but maintaining internal control and preventing unrest. These weren't elite troops, but the bottom tier of Egypt's military hierarchy, men who lacked the skills or connections for more prestigious assignments. Guard duty at remote mining operations was considered a punishment posting for soldiers, something reflected in their often brutal treatment of miners. Nothing improves workplace morale quite like giving people who hate their jobs authority over people who have even worse jobs. The psychological profile of effective overseers was remarkably consistent across different mining operations and time periods. They needed sufficient empathy to anticipate resistance and unrest, but not enough to be troubled by the suffering they administered. They required intelligence to solve logistical problems, but limited reflectiveness about the moral implications of their role. Above all, they needed to believe in the fundamental rightness of the system they enforced, that the social hierarchy placing them above miners was natural, divinely ordained, and unquestionable. The Egyptians didn't have formal psychological screening, but they effectively selected for functional sociopaths with strong authoritarian tendencies and underdeveloped moral reasoning. It was like having an HR department specifically recruiting people who failed the basic human decency section of the personality assessment. Training for overseers focused on practical control techniques rather than mining knowledge. New supervisors learned how to identify potential troublemakers, how to make examples through targeted punishment, and how to balance violence and incentives to maximize productivity. They were taught to create internal divisions among miners, setting different ethnic groups or categories of prisoners against each other to prevent unified resistance. One particularly effective technique was the strategic application of small mercies, occasionally reducing workloads or providing extra rations, not from compassion, but to create dependency and gratitude for minimal concessions. Modern corporate management calls this Employee Appreciation Day. Ancient Egyptian minds called it making them grateful we didn't beat them today. The relationship between overseers and miners was complex. Daily interaction created strange intimacies. Supervisors often knew more about their workers' physical conditions and limitations than anyone else in the operation. Some overseers developed protective attitudes toward their miners, not from compassion, but from the same possessive instinct that makes people maintain their tools. Others seemed to genuinely believe they were helping miners by teaching them to adapt to inescapable circumstances. The most effective overseers weren't those who enjoyed cruelty, but those who viewed it as simply part of an efficient operation, applying violence with the same detached calculation they might use to determine optimal tunnel supports or water rations. Language and communication systems reinforced control hierarchies. Overseers used specific linguistic patterns, short commands, consistent terminology, and simplified grammar that emphasized power differences and minimized minors' personhood. Many deliberately spoke louder than necessary, using volume as another dominance display in environments where sound carried psychological weight. Communication between minors was actively discouraged through tunnel assignments that separated friends or family members, noise levels that made conversation difficult, and punishment for excessive talking. It was the ancient world's version of prohibiting employees from discussing their salaries, except the penalty was whipping rather than a stern email from HR. The administration of punishment followed specific protocols designed to maximize psychological impact while preserving labor capacity. Public beatings were calculated performances, severe enough to terrify witnesses, but not so damaging that the victim couldn't return to work. Water and food restriction was precisely calibrated to cause suffering without triggering complete collapse. Even execution, when deemed necessary, was conducted as theater, elaborate, visible, and explicitly connected to specific transgressions to reinforce behavioral boundaries. Punishment wasn't just punishment. It was communication, a visceral language of power spoken through broken skin and empty stomachs. But overseers faced their own psychological challenges. Therefore, many developed distinctive coping mechanisms to manage their role in this system of suffering. Some embraced religious justifications, viewing themselves as instruments of divine order. Others maintained strict separation between their professional and personal identities, becoming different people inside and outside the mines. The most common adaptation was a progressive deadening of empathy, not just toward minors, but in all relationships. Archaeological evidence from overseer quarters suggests higher rates of alcohol consumption than in comparable professional groups, possibly indicating attempts to self-medicate against moral injury or psychological strain. Even enforcing suffering exacted its cost, just not nearly as high as the price paid by those suffering under their control. The turnover rate among overseers was remarkably high. Few lasted more than a few years before requesting transfer, developing debilitating health problems, or simply disappearing from historical records. Those who remained longest often displayed signs of significant psychological deterioration, increasing violence, erratic decision-making, or retreat into obsessive procedural adherence. Some administrative documents include references to overseers who became like the rock, a phrase possibly indicating psychological breakdown characterized by emotional rigidity and detachment. The mines consumed their administrators too, just more slowly and less visibly than they devoured the miners. Perhaps most revealing is how former mining overseers were viewed in Egyptian society. Despite performing essential functions for the state, they carried a subtle stigma, not officially sanctioned, but socially real. Their specialized skills had limited application elsewhere, and their known association with the mines made them uncomfortable additions to other workplaces or communities. They were necessary, but disturbing figures, tolerated rather than respected. Even in a society that accepted slavery and harsh punishment as normal, those who administered the most extreme forms of these practices occupied an uneasy social position. They were the machine's necessary operators, but the machine itself remained too disturbing to acknowledge directly. What makes the psychology of mining overseers relevant beyond ancient history is how little the fundamental dynamics have changed. Modern research on prison guards, authoritarian systems, and corporate exploitation reveals the same patterns of selection, adaptation, justification, and psychological consequence. The faces and uniforms change, but the underlying human machinery remains disturbingly consistent. Systems of oppression still require human operators willing to value order over compassion, productivity over personhood, and authority over empathy. The ancient Egyptians didn't invent this dynamic. They merely perfected it in the service of gold. The true horror of the overseer system wasn't the cruelty of individual men, but the efficiency with which it transformed ordinary people into instruments of systematic oppression. The mines didn't just extract gold from the earth and life from miners. They extracted humanity from those who operated them, creating a self-perpetuating machinery of suffering that operated with the cold precision of the divine order it claimed to serve. But what happened to the gold itself once it was torn from the earth? Where did this precious metal go after it left the bloodied hands of those who extracted it? The journey of gold after the mines reveals perhaps the most bitter irony of this entire system. While miners suffered and died in darkness, the gold they extracted began its own remarkable journey, traveling from blood-soaked tunnels to gleaming temples, from anonymous hands to divine adornment. If you could somehow follow a single gold particle from its extraction to its final resting place, you'd witness perhaps the most dramatic social transformation in ancient history, the metamorphosis of pain into power, of suffering into sanctity, of darkness into dazzling light. The journey began with extraction, the moment when rock yielded its treasure. But gold rarely announced itself with obvious sparkle. Therefore, miners had to develop an almost supernatural ability to detect subtle signs of its presence. However, even experienced miners could work for days without finding viable ore. Thus, the extraction process wasn't just physically brutal, but psychologically tortuous, combining back-breaking labor with the constant anxiety of coming up empty-handed. Once identified, gold-bearing quartz was broken into smaller pieces underground, then carried to the surface in reed baskets or leather sacks. The physical toll of this transport was enormous. Miners climbed narrow, steep passages while carrying loads that might represent an entire day's extraction. The contrast between the miners' ascent and the gold's couldn't be more stark. The gold was beginning its upward journey toward light and reverence. The miners were merely making a temporary trip to the surface before descending again. It was like being an Uber driver for precious metal. You might share the ride, but your passenger was heading to a much better destination. At the surface, ore processing began immediately. This wasn't the job of tunnel miners, but of a separate workforce. Often women, children, and elderly miners no longer capable of underground work. Using stone mortars and pestles, they crushed gold-bearing quartz into fine powder, a process that might take hours per basket. The air around crushing areas was filled with silica dust, creating another health hazard. These workers developed distinctive arm and shoulder deformities from the repetitive crushing motion, along with respiratory diseases from constant dust inhalation. Imagine the world's most deadly fitness class, CrossFit, ancient Egyptian edition, where the workout is crushing rocks and the prize is slowly suffocating on mineral particles. The crushed ore then moved to washing stations, shallow sloped channels where water was poured over the material to separate heavier gold particles from lighter rock dust. This process required enormous amounts of water, a precious resource in desert mining regions. Water was often carried for miles by dedicated porters, creating another chain of suffering that extended well beyond the mines themselves. The washing process was overseen by specialists who could detect the subtle gleam of gold among the slurry. Any worker who missed gold particles or allowed them to wash away faced severe punishment. Quality control in ancient Egypt didn't involve customer satisfaction surveys. It involved whips and reduced rations. Now came the most dangerous phase, amalgamation with mercury. The washed gold concentrate was mixed with liquid mercury in ceramic bowls, creating a mercury-gold amalgam that separated the precious metal from remaining impurities. Workers used their bare hands to mix these toxic materials, absorbing mercury directly through their skin. The amalgam was then heated, vaporizing the mercury and leaving behind relatively pure gold. Those performing this task inhaled mercury vapors directly, suffering the most severe neurological damage of any workers in the process. The tragic irony: these refiners often became known for their constantly trembling hands, a symptom of severe mercury poisoning that, perversely, came to be associated with their awe of handling sacred material rather than recognized as evidence of their poisoning. The resulting gold, now about 80–90% pure, was melted in crucibles and poured into molds to form ingots or blanks for further working. This process required intense heat from charcoal fires, creating workspace temperatures that could exceed 200 degrees. The workers who managed these fires developed distinctive burn patterns on their bodies, along with chronic respiratory problems from charcoal smoke. But these metalworkers held slightly higher status than miners. Therefore, they received somewhat better treatment and rations. Their higher position in the labor hierarchy brought them nothing but a slightly slower death and the dubious privilege of seeing the gold take shape before it disappeared forever from their world. The gold's physical transformation was now complete, but its social transformation was just beginning. From the mining regions, it traveled under heavy guard to administrative centers where it was weighed, recorded, and taxed before continuing to its final destinations. The scribes who documented these transfers were often the only literate individuals miners would ever encounter. They arrived periodically from Memphis or Thebes, pale bureaucrats whose reed pens assigned numerical values to months of suffering. These administrators rarely entered the mines, preferring to conduct their business in temporary shelters near the refining areas. Ancient Egyptian accountants had a lot in common with modern ones. They both turn human activity into numbers, though at least modern accountants don't usually carry whips to their audits. From provincial centers, the gold moved to 3 primary destinations: royal treasuries, temples, or workshops. Each path represented a different aspect of gold's sacred and political significance in Egyptian society. Gold bound for royal use traveled to secure storehouses in the capital, where it became literal backing for pharaonic authority. Temple gold went directly to religious centers, where it was incorporated into ritual objects or architectural elements. Gold destined for crafting went to specialized workshops, where highly skilled artisans, who might use in a day what took miners months to extract, transformed it into objects of astonishing beauty and technical sophistication. The contrast between extraction and crafting couldn't be more extreme. Miners worked in darkness, dirt, and constant danger using the crudest tools. Royal goldsmiths worked in well-lit, well-ventilated spaces using specialized instruments capable of manipulating gold at microscopic levels. Miners received minimal sustenance and no recognition. Goldsmiths enjoyed privileged status, good nutrition, and sometimes even had their names recorded alongside their creations. One group destroyed their bodies to extract the material. The other group was celebrated for transforming it. It was the ancient world's most extreme example of supply chain inequality, like comparing the conditions of coltan miners in modern Congo with the clean labs where their extracted materials become iPhone components. The objects created from mining gold reflected every aspect of Egyptian power and belief. Funerary masks and coffin decorations made the dead symbolically divine. Temple fixtures literally embodied the god's presence on earth. Royal regalia reinforced the pharaoh's semi-divine status. Jewelry for elites displayed status while providing magical protection. These weren't just decorative objects. They were physical manifestations of cosmic order, tangible evidence of Egypt's special relationship with divine forces. That cosmic order, of course, conveniently required that some people die in darkness so others could shine in the sun. But perhaps the most profound transformation wasn't physical or even social. Therefore, it was conceptual, how gold's meaning changed at each step of its journey. In the mine, gold was simply dangerous yellow material embedded in rock. For administrators, it was quantifiable wealth expressed in weight and purity. For artisans, it was an artistic medium with unique properties. For priests, it was divine flesh made tangible. For royalty, it was power made visible. Each group encountered the same substance, but experienced entirely different relationships with it, from the miners who died extracting it to the pharaohs who were literally buried in it. The final destinations of mining gold reveal ancient Egypt's ultimate priorities. Most went to temples and tombs, places dedicated to eternity rather than everyday life. The civilization was literally investing its most precious resource, and the lives of thousands of workers in spiritual infrastructure and afterlife preparation. Less than 20% of extracted gold was used for practical purposes like currency, trade, or diplomatic gifts. The rest went toward ensuring proper relationships with gods and provisioning the dead for their journey to the field of reeds. It was the ancient world's most extreme example of religious spending. Imagine if modern societies dedicated 80% of their most valuable resource exclusively to churches and cemeteries. For the average Egyptian, the completed objects might occasionally be glimpsed during religious festivals or royal processions, shining moments when ordinary people could bask briefly in reflected glory. For miners, these finished products might as well have existed in another universe. They would never see the gleaming statues, the intricate jewelry, or the dazzling architectural elements created from their suffering. The closest most came to seeing processed gold was catching the occasional gleam of a tiny particle in rock before it disappeared into the extraction system. The bitter alchemy of ancient Egypt wasn't turning lead into gold. It was converting human lives into divine accessories, transforming the suffering of the forgotten into the splendor of the remembered. The gold didn't just travel from mine to temple. It journeyed from one moral universe to another, a material transubstantiation where the base metal of human suffering became the gleaming symbol of cosmic order. And those who made this miracle possible? They remained buried in darkness, as forgotten in history as they were in their own time. But some refused to accept their fate. Despite overwhelming odds and seemingly impossible barriers, a few miners dared to imagine something almost as precious as the gold they extracted, freedom from the system designed to consume them. The thought haunted every miner who entered the tunnels. Is there a way out? Not just from the physical confines of rock and darkness, but from the system itself, the inescapable machinery of exploitation that consumed bodies and souls with the same methodical efficiency. Escape from Egyptian gold mines wasn't just difficult. It was an act of defiance against cosmic order, a rebellion against divine hierarchy, and practically speaking, nearly impossible. But humans are remarkably stubborn about survival, and even in this most hopeless of environments, some dared to imagine freedom. Physical escape faced immediate, brutal obstacles. Mining operations were typically located in remote deserts or mountains, surrounded by inhospitable terrain that served as a natural prison wall. But the isolation wasn't just geographical, therefore it was strategic. Operations were deliberately established in landscapes that would kill escaped workers before they reached civilization. However, miners intimately familiar with local geology sometimes possessed knowledge that overseers lacked. Thus, the very expertise that made them valuable underground occasionally provided escape routes overseers never imagined. The most immediate barrier wasn't distance, but water. Mining settlements controlled water access with military precision. Rations were carefully measured, storage was guarded, and sources were often fenced or walled. Without water, desert escape was suicide, a fact overseers reminded miners of regularly. Some particularly cruel administrators would display the bodies of failed escapees who had died of thirst, leaving them at settlement perimeters as gruesome warnings. It was ancient Egypt's version of a retention policy. Less casual Fridays and competitive benefits, and more, look at your dehydrated former colleague slowly mummifying in the sun. Guards were the second line of defense against escape. They patrolled perimeters, monitored workers during shifts, and conducted regular counts. But guard forces were typically small relative to miner populations, often just one guard per 50 or 60 workers. This wasn't due to overconfidence but resource calculation. Egyptian administrators understood that the desert was their most effective security system, requiring minimal human reinforcement. The mathematics of escape was brutally simple. Even if you somehow evaded guards, you still faced the killing emptiness of sand and sun. Prison architects today call this passive security, using environmental features to minimize the need for active monitoring. The ancient Egyptians just called it, put the mines in places where nothing survives. For those who overcame these obstacles, navigation presented the next challenge. Landmarks in desert regions were subtle and easily misinterpreted. Stars provided guidance at night, but traveling during daylight hours was nearly impossible due to heat. Seasonal wadis and hidden water sources existed, but their locations were specialized knowledge. Some evidence suggests escaped miners occasionally reached nomadic Bedouin groups who inhabited desert regions, either to be helped or, more commonly, to be returned to authorities for reward. Bedouin tribes had complex relationships with Egyptian authorities, sometimes trading partners, sometimes hostile, making them unpredictable encounters for desperate escapees. It was the ancient equivalent of your escape plan, depending on whether you ran into someone having a good day or someone who'd just had their camel spit on them. The penalty for failed escape was designed not just to punish, but to communicate. Recaptured miners faced public torture before being assigned to the most dangerous sections of the mines. Some historical records suggest particularly determined escapees might be hamstrung, their Achilles tendons partially severed to permit work while preventing running. Others were chained to other workers, creating collective responsibility that discouraged group escapes. The message was clear: your body belongs to the mine until it no longer functions. Ancient Egyptian HR didn't offer resignation options or 2 weeks' notice. Your employment contract terminated when your breathing did. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, escapes did occur. Therefore, detailed records of successful attempts are, by definition, limited. Historical evidence comes primarily from administrative documents complaining about labor shortages or requesting replacement workers. Archaeological findings occasionally reveal remains of mining workers far from known settlements, suggesting some fled and died in the attempt. More tantalizing are fragmented references to former mining workers identified in communities hundreds of miles from known operations, hinting at rare successful escapes. These documents are the ancient Egyptian equivalent of passive-aggressive company-wide emails about regrettable departures from the team, bureaucratic acknowledgements that someone beat an impossible system. The most successful escapes appear to have been opportunistic rather than planned. Miners assigned to water transport or accompanying supply caravans had the best chances, finding themselves temporarily beyond the most secure perimeters, with access to survival necessities. Others escaped during rare seasonal flash floods that disrupted operations and security. Some evidence suggests occasional success during administrative transitions, when oversight temporarily weakened. The odds were still overwhelmingly against success. Historical estimates suggest fewer than 1 in several thousand mining workers ever escaped successfully. Las Vegas would love those odds, though they'd probably still find a way to put their thumb on the scale. Group escapes faced even longer odds, but occurred nonetheless. The most significant recorded incident took place during the late New Kingdom period, when approximately 60 miners overwhelmed guards during a supply delivery and fled with stolen water and provisions. Administrative records indicate most were recaptured or found dead, but intriguingly note that 14 remain unaccounted for, a bureaucratic admission of possible success. Other records mention smaller groups of 3 to 5 workers occasionally disappearing, particularly during seasonal migrations of nomadic groups through mining regions. These might be the only heist crews in history where the goal wasn't stealing gold, but escaping from it. For those who somehow beat the overwhelming odds and successfully escaped, integration into society presented new challenges. Escaped miners carried visible markers of their former occupation: distinctive physical deformities, chronic respiratory problems, tremors from mercury poisoning, and psychological trauma. Some evidence suggests successful escapees gravitated toward port cities where diverse populations and labor shortages made questions about origins less common. Others apparently joined desert nomadic groups, trading their knowledge of Egyptian operations for acceptance. The most successful completely changed identities, never again using their original names or acknowledging their past. It was the ancient world's witness protection program, except without the government stipend and suburban house. The psychological impact of successful escape brought its own challenges. Survivors of extreme exploitation often describe difficulty adjusting to freedom. experiencing panic in open spaces after years underground, or struggling with basic decision-making after living under absolute control. Some historical accounts mention escaped miners who voluntarily returned to settlements, unable to function in the outside world, an ancient manifestation of institutionalization similar to what modern prison populations experience. Freedom after systematic dehumanization wasn't just a change of location, it required reconstituting a sense of self that the mines had methodically destroyed. Perhaps most remarkable were the rare cases of escaped miners who became guides for desert caravans or even military operations. Their intimate knowledge of remote regions, hidden water sources, and navigation techniques occasionally transformed from survival knowledge into valuable expertise. A few fragmentary records suggest former mining workers sometimes guided military raids, targeting the very operations they had escaped. Acts of revenge cloaked as patriotic service to new communities. These individuals represent history's most dramatic career transitions, from exploited resource to specialized expert, from victim to strategic asset. The legacy of these escapes exists less in historical records than in cultural memory. Folk traditions throughout regions surrounding ancient mining operations contain stories of miraculous survivals, individuals who walked out of the desert when such journeys seemed impossible. These narratives often took on mythic qualities, with escaped miners portrayed as possessing supernatural endurance or divine protection. In some traditions, successful escapees became protective spirits who could be invoked by travelers facing desert journeys. Modern anthropologists might classify these as resistance narratives, stories that preserve memories of defiance when historical records written by the powerful omit them. What these rare successes demonstrate isn't just human endurance, but the fundamental failure of even the most carefully designed systems of control. No matter how overwhelming the odds, how brutal the punishment, or how complete the domination, some irreducible spark of human freedom remains. The ancient Egyptians created perhaps the most comprehensive exploitation system in early human history, one that controlled every aspect of miners' existence from sleep to food to breath itself. Yet even this totalitarian regime couldn't achieve 100% containment. The escaped miners of ancient Egypt left almost no trace in the historical record. Their names aren't carved in temples or written in papyrus annals. Their achievements weren't measured in monuments, but in heartbeats experienced in freedom rather than bondage. They remind us that history's most meaningful victories sometimes leave no mark except the simple, profound triumph of refusing to remain where others have decided you belong. History is written by the survivors, they say. But in ancient Egypt, history was literally written by specialized scribes, whose job was documenting the glory of pharaohs, the wisdom of priests, and the grandeur of monuments. What they almost never recorded were the lives of those who built that glory from below, the thousands of unnamed miners whose broken bodies and crushed spirits were the invisible foundation of Egypt's golden splendor. Their systematic erasure from historical memory wasn't accidental. It was the final stage of exploitation, denying them even the dignity of being remembered. The magnificent tombs, temples, and treasures of ancient Egypt have captivated scholars and tourists for centuries, but these gleaming artifacts tell only half the story. Therefore, the complete history requires looking not just at what ancient Egyptians proudly displayed, but at what they deliberately concealed. However, archaeological evidence increasingly reveals the shadows behind the light. Thus, modern researchers are piecing together the lives of mining populations through evidence the Egyptians never intended to preserve. Official records from ancient Egypt mention mining operations primarily in administrative contexts. Cold, numerical accounts of gold production, worker allocations, and supply logistics. The New Kingdom. Papyrus Turin contains what amounts to the world's oldest surviving spreadsheet. Columns of figures tracking monthly gold yields from Nubian mines with notations about labor requirements. These documents discuss miners with the same detached tone they use for donkeys, water jugs, or tunnel support beams, as resources to be allocated rather than humans experiencing suffering. It's like finding a corporate quarterly report that lists environmental challenges without mentioning the toxic waste dumped in local waterways. The numbers tell a precise story while completely obscuring the human reality. Religious and royal inscriptions acknowledge mining regions primarily as sources of divine material or as demonstrations of Egypt's dominion over foreign lands. These texts describe gold as the flesh of the gods, or the breath of divine power, while remaining conspicuously silent about the human breath extinguished to obtain it. Pharaohs boasted of opening the mountain, or bringing forth the sacred metal, through their divine authority, grammatically positioning themselves as the active agents of extraction while rendering miners invisible. Even when mining expeditions are mentioned in royal autobiographies, they're framed as heroic royal achievements rather than systematic exploitation of disposable workers. Ancient Egyptian PR departments clearly understood the concept of strategic omission long before modern corporations perfected it. Pictorial evidence reveals similar patterns of erasure. Temple and tomb walls show elaborate scenes of goldsmiths creating magnificent objects, priests purifying gold for ritual use, and nobles presenting golden tribute to pharaohs. But depictions of actual mining work are extraordinarily rare. The few existing examples, like those in the tomb of Baktethray at Beni Hassan, show idealized versions of the process with workers in unrealistically spacious tunnels, using tools far more sophisticated than archaeological evidence suggests actually existed. The ancient Egyptians had the artistic equivalent of Instagram filters, making everything look better than reality long before digital technology came along. Literary texts from ancient Egypt, stories, poems, wisdom literature, mention virtually every profession, from farmers to physicians, brewers to boat builders, scribes to soldiers. But miners are conspicuously absent from these cultural narratives. Therefore, they existed outside the imaginative universe that Egyptians constructed through their literature. The systematic omission suggests not oversight, but intention. Miners were considered unworthy of cultural representation or acknowledgement. Not being tagged in ancient Egypt's cultural stories was more than just a social slight. It was existential erasure, a denial that your life had meaning worth recording. At least modern influencers only pretend you don't exist if you have fewer than 10,000 followers. The archaeological record, however, tells a different story, one the Egyptians never intended to preserve. Cemetery excavations near mining sites reveal bodies bearing the distinctive skeletal markers of mining labor, vertebral compression, asymmetrical muscle development, chronic fractures, and evidence of heavy metal poisoning. These anonymous remains provide silent testimony to the physical reality that official records so carefully avoided documenting. Unlike the carefully prepared mummies of pharaohs and nobles, miners' remains were typically interred in mass graves with minimal funerary provisions, reflecting their status as resources rather than people deserving proper transition to the afterlife. It was the ancient equivalent of being buried in the company parking lot after dying at your desk, technically acknowledged but fundamentally disrespected. Graffiti and informal markings found in abandoned mining tunnels offer rare glimpses of miners' own voices. Brief inscriptions, names, complaints, counts of days worked, occasional prayers, survive in remote passages where supervisors rarely ventured. These aren't the formal hieroglyphics of temple walls, but crude markings made by people with minimal literacy and maximum desperation. One partially preserved inscription from a Sinai turquoise mine translates roughly as, "Haiti was here for 700 days. The darkness never ends." Another simply repeats the word water 6 times. These poignant fragments represent the only instances where miners directly entered the historical record on their own terms. Ancient Egyptian miners invented the concept of bathroom graffiti, leaving their mark in the only place no one important would bother to look. Settlement archaeology provides further evidence of mining life. Excavations of worker housing reveal cramped, poorly constructed shelters with minimal provisions for comfort or hygiene. Unlike the planned communities built for other state workers, mining settlements show little evidence of design beyond functional necessity. The archaeological signature of these sites, thin occupation layers, limited personalization of space, minimal decorative objects, suggests populations who were actively prevented from developing place attachment or community identity. Modern corporate housing at least pretends to care about employee experience and work-life balance. Ancient Egyptian mining settlements didn't even bother with the pretense. Modern scientific techniques have dramatically expanded our understanding of mining populations. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains can identify individuals' geographic origins, revealing the diverse sources of mining labor. DNA studies show family relationships within mining communities, confirming the generational nature of mining enslavement. Trace element analysis of bones quantifies mercury and other toxic exposures, providing objective evidence of occupational poisoning. These techniques allow contemporary researchers to reconstruct aspects of mining life that ancient records deliberately obscured. Science is essentially conducting the world's coldest cold case, solving crimes of exploitation that the perpetrators thought would remain forever hidden. The contrast between ancient erasure and modern recovery raises profound questions about historical memory and justice. How do we properly account for suffering that exists only as archaeological trace evidence? How do we name the nameless and honor those who were systematically dishonored? The gold objects that fill museum collections worldwide were created through processes of exploitation that the objects themselves were partly designed to conceal. That beautiful funerary mask in the glass case represents not just artistic achievement, but strategic forgetting, the deliberate erasure of those whose suffering made its creation possible. Museums are getting better about acknowledging the uncomfortable histories behind their artifacts, though they still typically mention mining rather than systematic human exploitation, resulting in thousands of painful deaths in their descriptive placards. But this erasure wasn't unique to ancient Egypt. Therefore, it reflects patterns that continue today. Modern global supply chains similarly obscure the human costs of production, creating distance between consumers and the labor conditions behind their purchases. Just as ancient Egyptians could worship at golden temples without confronting the reality of mining death, contemporary consumers can admire gold jewelry without acknowledging that artisanal gold mining still kills thousands annually through mercury poisoning and dangerous conditions. The technologies have improved somewhat, but the strategic invisibility of extraction labor remains remarkably consistent. We're still quite good at not thinking about where our shiny things come from or who suffered to produce them. Some contemporary scholars have attempted to address this historical erasure through reconstructive projects, creating digital models of ancient mines, compiling databases of skeletal evidence, or producing detailed analyses of the technological and social systems that enabled exploitation. These efforts represent attempts at retroactive justice, restoring visibility to populations deliberately rendered invisible. But such academic exercises, while valuable, cannot fully address the fundamental injustice of historical erasure. The miners of ancient Egypt will never receive the elaborate tombs, biographical inscriptions, or cultural acknowledgement afforded to those who exploited them. This pattern of remembrance and forgetting, celebrating the products of exploitation while erasing its human costs, isn't just historical curiosity, but a fundamental mechanism through which power perpetuates itself. By controlling not just physical resources, but historical memory itself, systems of exploitation ensure their own continuation. The miners of ancient Egypt were erased not because they didn't matter, but precisely because acknowledging their humanity would have made the entire system of exploitation morally untenable. Their invisibility wasn't an oversight. It was the cornerstone of the system's self-justification. The gold of ancient Egypt still gleams in museums worldwide, reflecting light that miners never saw. The hieroglyphics still pronounce the eternal glory of pharaohs who built their immortality on anonymous suffering. The temples still stand as monuments to divine order that sanctified systematic exploitation. But beneath this carefully constructed memory lies another history, one written not in ink or carved in stone, but etched in bone and buried in sand. It speaks of lives consumed by darkness, bodies broken by labor, and souls erased by design. This shadow history reminds us that our most precious cultural treasures often conceal our most profound moral failures. But the story doesn't end with ancient Egypt. The legacy of this mining system extends far beyond the fall of pharaohs, creating patterns of exploitation that have survived with remarkable persistence into our modern world. The death of the last ancient Egyptian gold miner occurred over 2 millennia ago. The final heartbeat, the final exhaled breath filled with stone dust, the final pair of eyes closing in darkness, all now lost to time. But the system that consumed these forgotten lives didn't die with them. Therefore, it evolved, adapted, and in many disturbing ways, continues today. However, recognizing these historical patterns isn't just academic exercise. Thus, understanding the Egyptian mining system helps us identify its modern descendants and perhaps, finally, break a chain of exploitation that has survived for thousands of years. When the glory of ancient Egypt faded, their mining techniques spread like a contagion across the ancient world. The Romans, never ones to miss an opportunity for efficient exploitation, adopted and expanded Egyptian methods, adding their own innovations like hydraulic mining that could wash away entire hillsides. Their quicksilver, mercury, amalgamation process was directly inherited from Egyptian technology, as was their use of convicted criminals and conquered peoples as disposable mining labor. The Romans were essentially history's most successful plagiarists. They didn't invent new forms of mining exploitation. They just franchised the Egyptian model across 3 continents, with better marketing and infrastructure. The technological bloodline connecting ancient Egyptian mining to modern practices is surprisingly direct. The basic principle of mercury amalgamation, mixing mercury with crushed ore to bind with gold, then heating the amalgam to vaporize the mercury, remained the dominant gold extraction method until the late 19th century. Even the introduction of cyanide leaching in the 1890s merely replaced one poison with another. Modern industrial mines may use massive machinery and computer monitoring, but their fundamental approach, extract maximum material with minimum concern for human and environmental costs, would be immediately recognizable to an ancient Egyptian mining overseer. It's like comparing a stone tablet to an iPad. The interface has improved dramatically, but you're still essentially scratching marks onto a flat surface to communicate. The geographical footprint of gold mining expanded far beyond Egypt's borders, but the environmental consequences remained consistent. Ancient Egyptian mines left scars still visible in the eastern desert and Nubia, barren, contaminated landscapes where nothing grows even thousands of years later. Roman gold mines in Spain created toxic watersheds that continue to leach heavy metals today. Modern operations in places like Peru, Indonesia, and Ghana follow the same pattern of permanent environmental devastation, just on a vastly larger scale. Mining companies have perfected the art of changing their names and updating their logos every few decades, but the dead rivers and poisoned groundwater provide more honest corporate continuity. Labor practices show equally disturbing continuities. The International Labour Organization estimates that roughly 1 million children currently work in artisanal mines worldwide, many in gold extraction using mercury amalgamation, virtually identical to ancient Egyptian methods. Debt bondage, functionally indistinguishable from the debt slavery that supplied Egyptian mining labor, remains common in mining regions across developing nations. Even wage-based employment in many modern mining operations involves coercive practices, dangerous conditions, and systematic suppression of worker organization. Modern mining companies have excellent public relations departments and sustainability reports, but if you stripped away the corporate logos and CSR statements, the fundamental relationship between owners and workers would look remarkably familiar to an ancient Egyptian overseer. It's like comparing ancient chariots to modern luxury cars. The exterior design has changed dramatically, but they're still primarily vehicles for moving the privileged few over the bodies of the many. The psychological dynamics of extraction economies have shown particular resistance to change. Modern mining operations, like their ancient counterparts, typically exist in geographical and psychological isolation from the societies they supply. The physical and mental health impacts of mining work remain systematically underreported and undertreated. Corporate security forces in many mining regions function almost identically to ancient guards, controlling movement, suppressing dissent, and enforcing production quotas through intimidation. The strategic use of divisive hierarchies to prevent worker solidarity, pitting ethnic groups, employment tiers, or skill levels against each other, mirrors techniques documented in ancient Egyptian administrative texts. Modern management consultants charge millions to teach workforce optimization strategies that Egyptian overseers developed millennia ago without PowerPoint or business school jargon. Even the connection between gold and spiritual power has maintained remarkable consistency. While modern societies may not explicitly describe gold as divine flesh, our economic systems treat it with nearly religious reverence. National treasuries store gold reserves as symbols of state power and stability. Religious institutions continue to use gold as visual shorthand for divine presence. Luxury brands leverage gold's ancient associations with transcendent value to sell everything from smartphones to facial creams. Behind the sleek modern packaging lies the same fundamental message that Egyptian priests conveyed. Gold represents something beyond ordinary material value, something worth extraordinary sacrifice to obtain. We've replaced the gods with brands and pharaohs with billionaires, but the essential religious relationship with gold remains intact. But the most persistent legacy isn't technological or economic. Therefore, it's conceptual. The idea that human suffering is an acceptable, even necessary, cost of resource extraction. This notion, so clearly articulated in ancient Egyptian practices, remains embedded in modern economic thinking. The deaths of miners in developing nations are still calculated as unfortunate but acceptable risks, rather than fundamental moral failures. Environmental devastation is still treated as an externality rather than a core cost. The geographical and social distance between extraction and consumption still allows consumers to enjoy gold products without confronting their human cost. We've updated our accounting software, but we're still running the ancient Egyptian ethical algorithm that counts some lives as worth less than shiny metal. The human capacity to simultaneously know and not know about the origins of our precious materials represents perhaps the most enduring psychological legacy of ancient mining. Just as Egyptian temple worshippers could admire golden statues without thinking about the mining deaths that produced them, modern consumers can purchase gold jewelry without considering its extraction history. This strategic forgetting isn't accidental. It's designed into our economic systems, encouraged by marketing that emphasizes beauty and status while concealing production realities. The ancient Egyptians would immediately recognize our modern talent for compartmentalized awareness, for holding contradictory knowledge about the things we desire without experiencing cognitive dissonance. They might even admire how we've perfected their techniques for ethical disconnection through global supply chains that make the human costs of production practically invisible. Cognitive dissonance reduction isn't listed on product packaging, but it might be the most valuable service modern retail provides. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptian mining operations became increasingly efficient at resource extraction and worker exploitation over time. Each dynasty learned from previous administrations, refining techniques to maximize output while minimizing costs. Modern extractive industries follow the same pattern of optimization, using technological innovations and management systems to extract maximum value with minimum investment in human welfare or environmental protection. The language has changed from divine order to shareholder value, but the underlying calculation remains disturbingly similar. Corporate mission statements have replaced religious inscriptions, but they serve the same fundamental purpose, justifying systematic exploitation through reference to higher values. What would the miners of ancient Egypt make of our modern world? They might be amazed by our technological capabilities, but dismayed by how little has changed in the fundamental relationship between those who extract resources and those who benefit from them. They might recognize that while the physical chains have largely disappeared, the economic and social structures that constrain choice and opportunity remain firmly in place. They might wonder why, with all our knowledge and capacity, we haven't managed to break the pattern they experienced so long ago. Perhaps the most important legacy of ancient Egyptian gold mining isn't the gold itself, the beautiful artifacts that fill museums worldwide, but the moral challenge it continues to present. Every gold object from ancient Egypt asks a question that remains urgently relevant. What price are we willing to pay, or more accurately, what price are we willing to make others pay for the things we desire? The ancient Egyptians answered this question one way. Their answer shaped thousands of lives and deaths in the mines of the Eastern Desert and Nubia. The question remains before us, not as historical curiosity, but as immediate ethical choice. The miners of ancient Egypt vanished into historical shadow, their individual stories lost, their suffering unrecorded. But the system that consumed them survives in surprising forms, adapting across millennia, operating today in mines from Congo to Peru, from Indonesia to Ghana. Their legacy isn't just in museum displays of golden treasures, but in our continued struggle to value human life more than the metals we tear from the earth. The true inheritance of ancient Egyptian mining isn't gold, but the moral challenge of creating an extractive relationship with the earth that doesn't require sacrificing the vulnerable on the altar of luxury. And so we come full circle, from the darkness of ancient tunnels to the ethical questions that still shadow our modern pursuit of precious resources. We've descended together into one of history's darkest corners, a place where human suffering was so methodically engineered, so thoroughly normalized, and so deliberately forgotten that it challenges our understanding of civilization itself. The gold mines of ancient Egypt weren't just industrial operations. They were laboratories of exploitation, where the limits of human endurance were tested against the unlimited desire for precious metal. And in many ways, they created the template for extractive relationships that continue to shape our world. But the story of these mines isn't just about ancient cruelty. Therefore, it's about patterns of power and exploitation that transcend time. However, recognizing these patterns doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat them. Thus, our examination of this darkness might help illuminate paths toward different choices in our own time. The physical remains of ancient Egyptian gold mining are surprisingly modest. Eroded tunnels, scattered slag heaps, remnants of crude tools. Unlike the massive stone monuments that announced pharaonic glory to eternity, mining operations were never meant to be remembered. They were temporary wounds in the earth, ugly necessities best hidden from view. If pyramids were Egypt's public face, mines were its shadowed conscience, the unseen cost of visible splendor. Ancient Egypt essentially invented the corporate practice of keeping the factory in a different country than the flagship store. Same business model, just with fewer focus groups and more hieroglyphics. What makes these forgotten tunnels worth remembering isn't just historical curiosity. It's the recognition that every ounce of ancient Egyptian gold, every gleaming artifact in every museum worldwide, represents not just artistic achievement, but human cost. Behind each golden mask, each intricate pendant, each sacred statue lies a shadow history of crushed bodies, poisoned minds, and stolen lives. The mathematical conversion rate between suffering and splendor was never calculated by ancient scribes, but the equation was always there, buried beneath the official narratives of divine order and cosmic harmony. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of ancient Egyptian mining isn't how different it was from our world, but how familiar its fundamental logic remains. The geographical and moral distance between extraction and consumption, the strategic invisibility of those who produce versus those who benefit, the economic calculations that render some lives expendable in pursuit of luxury. These dynamics haven't disappeared. They've just adapted, evolved, and in some cases, become more sophisticated in their operation and justification. We've replaced divine order with market efficiency and pharaonic decree with shareholder value, but the underlying structure persists with remarkable resilience. Our ethical algorithms have received some updates, but they're still running on the ancient Egyptian operating system where certain sacrifices remain acceptable in pursuit of desired materials. When you next see gold, whether in museum displays, jewelry stores, or financial reports, perhaps you'll hear an echo from those ancient tunnels. Not just the hammers on stone or the labored breathing of miners, but the fundamental questions their suffering continues to ask. What is the true cost of the things we desire? Who bears that cost? And what stories do we tell ourselves to make those arrangements seem natural, inevitable, or justified? Modern archaeology has given voice to the miners ancient Egypt tried to silence. Modern ethics gives us choices ancient Egyptians never considered. The question isn't whether we'll continue to extract resources from the earth, we will, but whether we can finally break the ancient pattern that places the heaviest burdens on those with the least power to refuse them. The pharaohs built monuments reaching toward eternity, believing gold would carry them to immortality. But perhaps true civilization isn't measured by what we build or what we accumulate, but by whose suffering we refuse to accept as the necessary price of progress. The miners of ancient Egypt vanished into historical shadow, but their legacy continues in our ongoing struggle to value human dignity above the metals we tear from the earth.